Craig and Alan, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks so much for having us.
Why don't we start off with some background on what where you're coming from and how you got to where you are today. And Craig, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I don't know how far you want to go back, but I can start kind of in high school. I was very interested in the rigor of science and engineering. I decided to go off to Caltech to study aeronautical engineering. At that point, was doing all the classic things, an internship at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory and so on. But on the side, they made us study a bunch of stuff, including political science. And that's where I learned that political science could be treated like a science. We can develop hypotheses, we can test them, and really drew me into that approach. Caught my interest so much that after a couple of years, I actually transferred up to Stanford to study political science there, and then stayed on for my PhD, never looking back.
Great. And since Stanford, where have you been, and what are the various roles that you've had?
Sure. So after Stanford, went off to teach for a year at the University of Chicago, 4 years at Claremont Graduate University, then a couple of years at the University of Michigan, 8 years at Ohio State, and now about 10 years at the University of Virginia. So kind of a nomadic life after that, really always pursuing the link between politics and public policy.
Fantastic. And so Alan, how about you?
I have essentially absolutely no background in rocket science, nor aspirations to pursue it. Similar to many other people who are interested in politics, I think I started off as a stereotypical pre-law geek. When I entered undergrad, I fully expected to go to law school. And then in my sophomore year, actually, I engaged in a Washington, D.C. internship where I was interning for the state of Illinois office. And when I was out there, on the one hand, I completely caught Potomac fever. I fell in love with Washington, D.C. and the policymaking process. But at the same point, I also realized that I didn't really feel like I really knew much about the actual consequences of the policies that are being implemented. So I felt like I really need to learn a bit more about policy analysis and economics and the like. I came back to University of Illinois, which is where I went for undergrad, and finished up my bachelor's degrees there. And along those next year and a half, 2 years, I became apparent to me that pursuing a PhD could be really constructive in terms of helping me reach my goals, in terms of really understanding the causes and consequences of policymaking in Washington, D.C. So straight from University of Illinois, I went to Stanford Graduate School of Business, where I ended up actually in the same PhD program in political economics that Craig graduated from, even though we actually missed each other by about 6 months.
Great. And so what have you done since Stanford?
Since Stanford, my first academic position was at Ohio State, which is actually where Craig and I overlapped on the faculty. In between Stanford and Ohio State, I actually spent a year at the Federal Trade Commission, serving as an advisor to a federal trade commissioner and working in the Bureau of Economics. I was at Ohio State for 8 years, with the exception of a short stint when I was at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern teaching MBAs. And then in 2010, my family and I moved down to Nashville, Tennessee, and we've now been at Vanderbilt University for about 10 years.
So what did you do at the Trade Commission? That's a little bit different than some of the others we've talked to. So can you elaborate on what you would have done in there?
Yeah, so dating back to actually when I was in graduate school in 1999, I took off 6 months from graduate school to go out to the Federal Trade Commission. One of my faculty members at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, Jeremy Bulow, had taken over as the director of the Bureau of Economics. And he was interested in, just bringing in some new blood to just both get engaged with projects and also provide some advanced graduate students with the opportunity to see the ways in which economic policy is engaged with or implemented by the government. At the same point, actually dating back to my undergrad internship days, one of my mentors from my state of Illinois internship program was actually now the chief of staff to a federal trade commissioner. So between the two of them, I ended up working out a position where I was both working in the Bureau of Economics and learning about the economics of electronic commerce and the antitrust implications for electronic marketplaces on the internet. And at the same time, I was also serving as an ad hoc economic advisor to a commissioner on antitrust policy, consumer protection cases, and the like. And then in 2001, 2002, I went back to spend a year there because this is right after President Bush was elected. And I thought it'd be really interesting from a political scientist perspective to get insights as to the way in which the commission worked when it shifted from being under Democratic majority control to Republican majority control. So seeing that transition year was really fascinating. And then from there, I went on to Ohio State, as I said, and being at the commission really informed a lot of my research interests in bureaucratic policy and regulation, which is another area that I pursue in addition to the research that Craig and I engage with in studying lawmaking effectiveness in Congress.
Great. So why don't we talk, broad strokes about what areas each of you is interested in. Obviously, we're talking to you together because you're both involved on the legislative effectiveness work. But Craig, why don't, if you don't mind, just talk broadly speaking about what are your research areas, and then after that, hear from Alan, then we'll dive deeper into the legislative stuff.
Sure. So always fascinated with that link between politics and public policy. So, what public policies are we able to achieve given that they have to be passed through some political process? And so that led me to focus on a variety of American institutions. I've been interested in American federalism, in separation of powers institutions, and so on. So within American federalism, much of that politics of the policymaking process has focused on what we refer to as policy diffusion. If one state or locality adopts a particular policy, will it spread elsewhere? If it's a good idea, are those more likely to spread? And what are the pressures behind those sorts of policy changes? At the national level, I've been interested in kind of separation of powers issues. The president has some ideas. Do they make their way through Congress? What's the role of the veto? Sort of likewise, if Congress is interested in getting something done but doesn't have the expertise, how much are they willing to delegate to the executive branch to make those decisions within the bureaucracy? And now, of course, in terms of policy making, kind of who are those policymakers? Who are the lawmakers who actually get things done in Congress has really motivated our current projects.
So in terms of your background, you mentioned you started off more on the aerospace side. Have you been able to leverage any of that training in any of this political area? I mean, obviously there's a lot more rigor in terms of the quantitative methods compared to a lot of the history in political science, and maybe using more models and mathematics. Has that come up in your research, or is that something that is a former life that doesn't inform so much of what you're doing?
Right. The fact that I could marry those two areas was really what drove me to being the type of political scientist that I am now. So unless there's some theory somewhere that helps us develop those hypotheses that we can test, I'm not very satisfied with that. And that theory can be somewhat loose. It has to be grounded in who are the actors and what are they trying to accomplish. But in many cases, it's been game theoretic models undergirding what we've been up to there. So everything from kind of the spatial model of policymaking in Congress to some learning-based models for policy diffusion and how much you kind of go about all of the work that's necessary to set up a new policy and learn from it, or just kind of free ride on the learning of others in that policy diffusion process. And then the empirics side, the data. We need to gather data that are appropriate to answer the questions that we're asking and to test those hypotheses. And that's becoming more and more plentiful as just we have better information and data collection across the board in American politics.
Great. And Alan, maybe can you overview some of the research you've been working on over the years, not just the legislative side, but your broad interests?
Sure. Actually, Craig and I have a lot of natural overlap, both in our methodological approach as well as the substance of our work. With respect to the overlap, methodologically speaking, a lot of it probably follows organically from the fact that we went to the same graduate program. So for good or for ill, we were subjected to the same core curriculum that's aimed at cultivating a certain skill set and a way to engage with both theoretical and empirical analyses to advance our inquiries. I think in the broadest sense, my main interests in political science and public policy speak largely to the ways in which policy is created in representative institutions and the ways in which different political institutions could be leveraged either as constraints or alternatively facilitate opportunities for people to achieve their goals, both within and beyond these institutions. So in thinking about it in those broad ways, I'm fascinated by the ways in which legislative bodies operate and the ways in which individuals within legislative bodies can leverage the rules or perhaps create new rules to facilitate their goals. Moving beyond legislative politics, I'm also quite interested, especially in the American context, about the ways in which the bureaucracy, in the broadest sense, actually implements and creates the overwhelming majority of what we think of as law in the United States, which raises some very interesting and, I believe, truthfully, quite understudied questions about the ways in which the bureaucracy is delegated authority, the potential constraints that are placed on these agencies upon this authority being delegated, and really the extent to which either the legislative or in some cases the presidency itself can try to pull back or alternatively channel that bureaucratic authority once it's actually been let out of the box, so to speak. So most of my research activities, probably over the last 10 to 15 years, have in fact been focused largely on legislative politics at the national level of Congress for the most part, but as well as thinking about the ways in which Congress and the presidency interact with the bureaucracy to facilitate policy making.
Great. Well, let's move on to the congressional side of your work. And obviously, you guys have put together this great book on legislative effectiveness, and you've tried to quantify in some way how you can identify the right lawmakers in Congress and whether they can get their bills through Congress and giving them scores. Would you mind just kind of introducing the project as a whole, and then we can dive down into the details of it? Maybe either one of you can take that to start.
Yeah, why don't I start with a bit of the details and Alan can fill in. We've set up the Center for Effective Lawmaking, and that has a goal of all kinds of research on who the effective lawmakers are, and why it matters that some people are more effective in Congress than others, what that means for power, what that means for public policy creation. And a lot of that work is based on what we had done previously, the book that you mentioned, as well as the legislative effectiveness scores that undergird it. So I'll go into how we came up with our scores, and then maybe Alan can talk about some of the research findings out of them. So our legislative effectiveness scores were based on a conversation that Alan and I had when we were both back at Ohio State, where we were interested in knowing a little bit more about who these members of Congress were. At that point in time, if people were talking either in the political science community or the media about individual lawmakers, they were largely just characterizing them on one or two dimensions. One being, are you a Democrat or Republican? And the second, just how liberal or conservative are members? And that was crucial because Congress was becoming more polarized, and we knew that there were pretty major effects there. But Alan and I were kind of looking at individual bills and members and saying, some of the most liberal members, some of the most conservative members, some moderates are the ones who are actually always in the news, and others are the ones who are always getting things done. How much could we imagine looking at who actually gets things done in Congress? Who are the effective lawmakers? Is there a way to characterize that systematically, as both of us are guided by theory and data? And so we worked actually for a couple of years on thinking through that problem and eventually came up with our legislative effectiveness scores. These scores combine 15 different metrics based on the bills that members of Congress sponsor and how far they move through the lawmaking process. So we look at how many bills did a member sponsor? And in our early days, we were looking at sponsorships, co-sponsorships, amendments, all kinds of things. But we found that ultimately looking at them as the primary sponsor was tapping into the dimension we were looking at. And then we wanted to follow these bills throughout the lawmaking process to the extent that there was anything equivalent to our scores before. It had just been these hit rates of what % of your bills become law. And we found that really unsatisfying. You put forward one proposal and it becomes a law, suddenly you're the top performer, whereas somebody who works on a lot of issues and is pretty successful at many of them might get a lower score. So we wanted to account for a portfolio size, how many bills do you sponsor, and not just did they become law, because you can pick up a lot about who's effective and where they're effective by tracing different stages of the lawmaking process. So we looked at 5 stages, just from bill introduction to our second stage being action in committee. Did the bills get hearings or markups or subcommittee votes? To action beyond committee as our third step, did they reach the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate? to passing their home chamber as our 4th step, and to becoming law as our 5th step. And we were giving people more and more credit for things that are more and more rare. So lots of people introduce bills. There are thousands in any 2-year Congress. Many fewer are getting action in committee, many fewer are passing their home chamber, many fewer are becoming law. And then, of course, we know that bills are different from one another. And so we had to find a way to characterize that. We didn't want to have to go through scoring every bill. We didn't know exactly how to do that, nor objectively how to do that. But we also didn't want to leave it that every bill was ranked the same. And so we came up with 3 broad categories. Kind of the lowest one, where people get very little credit, is the commemoratives, your naming of post offices and so on. Many bills are substantive. They're not just namings. They're not just minting coins. They're dealing with substantive issues, and that's our middle category. But then we came up with our top category for the most important laws, what we call the substantive and significant bills. And those are the ones that are tackling the major issues of the day, getting lots of media attention. We characterize that objectively by, are they mentioned by Congressional Quarterly, which is kind of an inside baseball publication. And so that gives us these 5 stages of the lawmaking process and 3 levels of bill significance, which we combine into a weighted metric, a legislative effectiveness score that we normalize to a value of 1 in each Congress. So we can say 1 is kind of the average, 0 if you don't introduce anything, and member scores range up to in the 20s and so on for the people who are really effective. And we've been able to score every member of the House and every member of the Senate back to the early 1970s and up through today.
Good. And then once we had that data at our disposal, obviously the book, as you made reference to, a big part of it was trying to present the data and make sure it's clear that it had some degree of face validity, that it was essentially measuring what we thought it was measuring, and then present a series of questions regarding essentially what contributes to or detracts from the effective lawmaking of members of the U.S. House from 1973 to 2008. We presented a variety of findings in the book regarding which types of members, based on their own background or personal characteristics, are more or less likely to be successful. And then based on those findings in that book, we set forth what we believe is the foundation for the research agenda that is going to take us for the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years in the Center for Effective Lawmaking, in which our research activities in the broadest sense, as well as our outreach activities, are organized around 3 broad themes that are part of what we refer to as the Building a Better Congress project. So one theme is what we refer to as identification. We're trying to understand what it is about individuals' backgrounds or their personalities or their previous occupations, in the broadest sense, things that they did prior to becoming members of Congress that might be correlated with their success once they get to Congress. Can we identify those traits? The second broad theme we refer to as cultivation, conditional on being elected. What strategies or skills or tactics could an individual cultivate to, or perhaps members of the majority or minority party help them cultivate, to either contribute to or perhaps detract from their effective lawmaking in Congress? And the third broad theme that we're focused on studying is what we refer to as accountability. To what degree are members of the mass public or the electorate, broadly considered, interested in the entire concept of what we refer to as legislative effectiveness? If they're informed about the relative lawmaking effectiveness of their incumbent members, are they interested in that? Do they care? Do they base their voting decisions on that? Moving beyond the electorate, how about interest groups or more focused interests? Do they think about an individual's lawmaking effectiveness when they engage with them in Congress? Or alternatively, if people are relatively ineffective in certain policy areas, are they less likely to attract support from external constituencies? So these broad themes, identification, cultivation, and accountability, really lay out the roadmap for a variety of research questions that we're engaging with now, building on research over the last 10 years. So looking at some of the broad findings or broad ways in which we've been engaging with these questions, we like to think that we've come up with a pretty strong collection of empirical regularities that could help to provide guidance to both interested members of the public as well as members of Congress themselves about what strategies they could employ, or alternatively, what factors contribute to or perhaps detract from lawmaking effectiveness in Congress. So for example, in the current political environment, there's arguments as to whether or not there's any virtue in engaging in bipartisanship. And one of the points that emerges from a more recent study that Craig and I, as well as Laurel Hartbridge Young at the Northwestern University, have demonstrated is that in both the House and the Senate, even within these incredibly contentious political times, it's still the case that those members of the House and Senate who engage in meaningful bipartisan actions as measured by their ability to generate co-sponsors or attract co-sponsors from members of the other party are notably more effective and more successful at advancing their bills than those who essentially go it alone or reach out primarily to members of their own party to help to try to facilitate their success. You know, if you think about a newly elected member of the House and Senate, one of the first things they need to do is actually hire a staff. We might want to ask ourselves, well, do staff choices or staffing choices really influence, or are they correlated with one's lawmaking effectiveness? And one of the points that Craig and I have found with our co-authors is that it's unambiguously the case that members of Congress, especially newly elected members of Congress, should be trying to seek out and acquire and hire those individuals who have some meaningful Hill experience, rather than perhaps hiring campaign loyalists or campaign staffers who have relatively limited Hill experience. We find among newly elected members of the House, those who are able to attract and hire reasonably experienced members of Hill staff are notably more effective than those similarly situated freshman members of the House who have very little staff experience. We could go down the list to think about broad questions about institutional reform. One of the questions that Craig and I engaged in our earlier work was to try to assess the consequences of the term limits on committee chairs that were imposed in the 104th Congress under the Republicans back in 1995. And one of the points we were able to demonstrate in a very robust manner was that those members of Congress who continued to serve in chair positions following the imposition of chair term limits were notably less effective than those who had served in Congress prior to term limits on chairs being implemented, which raises some very important and broad questions and guidance, we think, about the ways in which some of the institutional reforms that Congress has experimented with over the past 20 and 30 years has contributed to, or in this case, we'd argue, has detracted from the acquisition of expertise, internal knowledge, policy knowledge that can facilitate legislative success. And Craig, I'm sure you could point to others.
Yeah, so just a couple things that I'd point out in terms of what the center allows us to do. One is just that we have this faculty affiliates program where we have a dozen or more faculty affiliated with us from across the country. I think we're up to 22 or something at this point, Alan. And they're able to engage with us on a variety of ideas and couple with one another in their co-authorship activities. And so it really builds up this community of scholars who are interested in similar questions. That keeps us always thinking and always getting feedback from one another. And so that's been fantastic in terms of the scholarly community. But then the second big thing is just engaging with the policy process, engaging with those lawmakers. So having the opportunity to talk to new lawmakers about what they're struggling with, or the members or staff of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, what sort of reforms are they interested in? And by engaging on those fronts, we can present our work, but simultaneously we hear their questions of, oh, I'd love to know more on these issues. How much would this reform help? What should we think about staff benefits? What should we think about bipartisanship and so on? And that seeds new research ideas back and forth. And so as much as we have the broad outlines of what we're currently working on, the number of new ideas that are coming to us by engaged faculty around the country, as well as members of Congress, their staff and others, has just been tremendous. We have more ideas than we have time to complete them by a long margin.
Yeah, I think it's great that you've taken this kind of data-driven approach and brought a kind of systematic view to it that a lot of others can leverage, right? And can see a methodology to try to improve things with evidence backing it up, rather than more of a straight historical view or a story-based view. The data can tell you, for instance, whether the term limits had an impact or not, and you can actually quantify that. It's much more powerful, and I think that's one of the great contributions of your work. And I think another area that you didn't mention, but I'd like to ask about is the issue specific findings that you had, because obviously different issue areas may be harder or easier to get bills passed, right? And specialization might lead to some people that are very effective in passing bills in one particular area, but obviously not in another. So I'd like to hear more about your findings related to that. It's not just a matter of is the lawmaker good at passing laws? It's, are they good at getting laws passed in X field, right? And I think that's an important specialization, particularly as it relates to committees, that is worth, understanding a little bit more in detail.
Sure. Yeah. So I can start on that one as well. So a little bit in the book, but much more recently, we've been exploring 20 different issue areas on which members can be effective. And essentially, as far as our methodology, we're able to do just exactly the same things as we did on our overall legislative effectiveness score. But now, instead of looking at every bill, we'll look first at all of the bills dealing with health and come up with a health score, all of the bills dealing with education and so on, and come up with scores along those lines. We're going to make all of those scores widely available on our website, just like we do with all of our data. As you were mentioning, Matthew, having that data available both to the public, you can just sort of click on our maps and find out who the effective lawmakers are, but also to the research community, as we have all of the data for download there, is really helping build up this overall enterprise. But on the issues specific scores, one thing that we did as an initial examination is just say, who are the members who are really general? So they're sponsoring, one bill in each of the 20 different issue areas. They're just getting their feet wet a little everywhere, probably because they're having some constituents who care about these different issues, or they're being lobbied on these fronts, versus those who are really specialists, those who dive in and, half of their bills are in health or in, science and technology issues or whatever area. And how effective are they along those lines? And so in a recent working paper, we kind of explored that, and we found there's something of a nonlinear relationship there, that being a extreme generalist or an extreme policy specialist, neither of those is the most optimal. The most optimal is you dedicate about half of your agenda to a single issue, but then you introduce in a few other areas as well. And that presents some opportunities. You could be a specialist in transportation, but it's not time to deal with transportation issues. Suddenly you're pretty ineffective. But if you diversify a little bit more, that helps with your effectiveness. But then we tracked, okay, well, just how consolidated or specialized are our people's agendas, and we found that 80 to 90 in the Senate recently, 95% of senators are less specialized than the optimum, and so almost everybody, we won't say everybody in Congress, but almost everybody in Congress would benefit if they want to be effective lawmakers from tailoring their agendas. Now, we understand there are pressures to, cater to those interest groups or, constituents, or show that you're active in an area and so on. But those pressures do push people away from effective lawmaking, away from specialization and gaining that expertise.
That makes a lot of sense. And, if we could talk a little bit about the first step in the chain, which is introducing bills. So can you talk a little bit about the distribution of lawmakers in terms of how many bills they really introduce, how many are, more of the commemorative versus the substantive versus the significant, and, how does that really, and whether they're freshmen versus they're in for 15 years, did any of your findings in kind of analyzing that first step, the bill introduction, kind of surprise you or give some interesting patterns that are worth noting?
No, that's a really good question, Matthew, because once we actually had the data, we're just in a position to engage with just some really primary research to get a sense of really what does the world look like in Congress at a given point in time, and has it changed across eras and the like. Craig, correct me if I'm wrong in terms of actual raw percentages, but in any given Congress, at least given the way we code up the data, I believe it's the case that we have approximately 3% of the data is what we denote as a commemorative bill, and roughly about 3% of the data is what we denote as substantive and significant, or the most important or salient pieces of legislation. Is that roughly correct in most Congress?
Yeah, I say about 5%, because certainly in the earlier years of our data, it was as high as 10% in many cases. So that substantive middle category is 80 to 90%, and then the tops and bottoms are fewer.
Yeah, yeah. And then in general, I mean, some things happen exactly the way you probably expect they would be occurring. And by that, I mean, more senior members of the chamber introduce more legislation, the more junior members of the chamber, relatively speaking. Members of the majority party tend to introduce more bills on average than members of the minority, but not necessarily, not a stark difference in many Congresses. When we dive into the data, one thing that did emerge in our analysis within our book, as well as some of our other published work, that was quite interesting to us was a notable gender difference that emerged with respect to members of the majority and minority party. And by that, I mean women in the minority party tend to introduce notably more legislation than their male counterparts in the minority party. Whereas when they're in the majority party, there are differences between men and women in terms of their introductions, but the difference isn't nearly as stark. And as we dove into the data, and this served as the foundation for some further analysis that we engaged in that was published in a paper with Dana Whitmer Wolf back in 2013 in the American Journal of Political Science, in which we explored the relative lawmaking effectiveness of male versus female members of Congress. What we found is that female members of Congress in the minority party are notably more successful at advancing their legislative agendas than men in the minority party. But in the majority party, the differences between men and women, are, especially in the more recent eras, are relatively de minimis. And what we found, interestingly enough, especially if we looked at the switch in power between majority to minority parties. So when a party was in the majority that then goes to the minority in the next Congress and vice versa, we found that on average, it's quite common that men who were in the majority party who've switched to the minority party, they start to engage in lawmaking in a very different way. They go from introducing a lot of legislation when they're in the majority party and trying to push their bills through the process to not engaging in the lawmaking process nearly as much when they're in the minority. They stop introducing bills. I mean, they'll still introduce, but not nearly as much. Actually, in the starkest examples, we can find cases in which some people who are quite prolific when they're in the majority party, as soon as they went to the minority, they stopped introducing almost any legislation. In contrast to what we see in many cases among men in Congress, women in Congress, regardless of whether or not they're in the majority or the minority party, they consistently try to advance their legislative portfolios. Even when they've moved into the minority party, they consistently try to introduce these bills and try to advance them through the committee system. And these factors, in tandem, that being women consistently trying to advance their legislation, regardless of whether or not their parties in the majority versus the minority, and men clearly engaging in differential tactics, depending on whether or not they're in the majority and minority party, contribute to this quite robust finding that we've observed in both the House as well as the Senate across eras, that minority party women are notably more effective lawmakers than minority party men.
Yeah, that's interesting. And what about in terms of the, your individual lawmaker? Are they all pretty similar in that, they typically a congressman will have a number of these commemoratives, a number of the substantive, and then one or two of the substantials? Or is it, a lot of lawmakers are just putting a bunch of commemoratives in, and that's their focus, and then others are focused on substantive? Is it quite a normal distribution across all the different lawmakers?
Greg?
It's all over the board, which is just really interesting to see. Because the numbers are small on the top end and the bottom end, on the commemoratives and on the substantive and significant. To fully characterize, I guess we haven't spent that much time trying to characterize who are the commemorative folks. But on the substantive and significant bills, there is a bias in media reporting that they're not going to report on a bill that's going to immediately die in committee. So they are going to report on the ones that are moving farther through the process, and we know that bills that move farther through the process tend to be from committee chairs and from members of the majority party, and so there is quite a bit of difference there in substantive and significant bills between the majority and the minority party. But I love this idea of diving into those different stages of the lawmaking process, and wanted to build on Alan's point there on two different fronts. One is with regard to the majority and the minority party. Not a huge gap. Certainly majority party members introduce more bills than minority party members. But once we get to stage two, are they getting hearings? Are they making it through committee and so on? that's where the majority party factor is coming in just so strongly. 5-1 or 10-1 as far as the majority party dominating the minority party in which bills move forward at the committee stage. An interesting finding we had is if you make it over that high hurdle and you're in the minority party and you get something to the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate, it's actually more likely to pass than bills that are sponsored by members of the majority party on the floor, which we found really intriguing. And then the second point I wanted to raise was just with regard to ideology. We had mentioned that there are all of these scores out there in terms of how ideologically conservative or liberal various members are. And we had thought there might be patterns there in our legislative effectiveness scores. And there are quite a few, but one that I want to mention is up front. People who are on the extremes of the spectrum, the really conservative members and the really liberal members, they introduce more bills, but they're not as successful with them. The moderates, when they come up with ideas, can kind of naturally build up a coalition. Because we track each of those stages and we give a lot of credit for each of the stages, more so for the rarer stages, we find that on average, moderates and extremists are about equal in accomplishing their goals or in our scores, because the extremists are raising more bills and the moderates are passing more laws, and that kind of balances out in our overall metric. Something you wouldn't know if you didn't crack it open to these different stages, as you're pointing out.
Yeah, well, a big challenge, I'm sure, related to understanding that is whether the bill itself has broad support or it's a narrower interest that might be more extreme or just only interesting to a narrow constituency. And of course, it's hard to score every bill along those lines. Even the sponsors won't probably know that answer very clearly. But it does bring up the question of, and the fundamental question of course, on your research is, if I'm a lawmaker, one way to get my ideas or my interests into law is through a bill that I sponsor, right? Another way is, I could tell the head of my committee, hey, I want this in the bill, and he could put it in his bill. Right. So you could have a very indirect way of getting your interests in the bill. You could amend a bill. There are lots of other ways to contribute your ideas into what's eventually becomes law. The easiest one to trace is the bills to law process, which is what you've got. That's where you have the data. But I wonder, have you tried to investigate these other areas of, because I'm sure some lawmakers would say, hey, I don't get my bills in, but there's a lot of my ideas in that what eventually becomes law. I just haven't used that channel. Have you looked at those other ways of contributing, and have you tried to quantify them at all?
That's a great question, Matthew. And that's, I'll take the first pass and Craig will hopefully jump in. That's a great question. And truthfully, that's an issue that we've wrestled with from day one in this project, because as you said, we have very good data on what people introduce and where it goes in the process. But that being said, there's lots of things that might get introduced that might find chunks of themselves in other legislative vehicles. And the way in which we engage in our current analysis, we can't account for the extent to which different bills are legislative vehicles for other things that were introduced at different stages, or even in more extreme cases, as you say, people pushing for broad ideas that then find their way into legislative language, even though no one ever authored them. So this is something we've been wrestling with. We think about it quite earnestly, and we're currently working with a team of scholars to come up with what we hope will be what we refer to as LES 2.0, so to speak. And that would be a legislative effectiveness score that actually accounts for the extent to which the bills that someone sponsors are their own. And by that, I mean in terms of actual text, or alternatively, they're borrowing portions or chunks of text from other legislative vehicles that other people have introduced within that Congress. And as a result, people will get portions of credit for having bills go further and further through different stages of the legislative process if those bills actually have portions of their own legislative language they introduced in other vehicles. So that's one way that we'll hopefully be able to account for the extent to which people, for example, the minority party, might introduce bills and they might have very little hope of getting the bill as its own standalone legislative vehicle, making its way all through the legislative process into law. But they might be fortunate enough to have some portion of that bill find its way into a different legislative vehicle that does advance further, perhaps on the part of a majority party sponsor. And hopefully the metric that we devise would allow us to provide those initial sponsors some degree of credit towards a legislative effectiveness score in a way that we can't currently do. The broader issue, however, that you allude to, that being a situation in which people, literally have ideas and they're articulating those ideas to individuals who then write bills, but the individuals who write bills are the people whose bills are going forward. It's not the case that the people who had the idea ever even wrote anything. At the moment, we haven't devised or haven't really thought about a systematic way to codify that type of process, but it goes without saying that definitely happens. We know that's important, and this is once again another great thing about working with such a substantial and intellectually diverse team of research affiliates at these different universities. Many people are interested in precisely these types of questions and brainstorming a bit as to how we could go about really cracking open the lawmaking process, especially at the committee stage, which we know lots of these types of things occur, even though it's very difficult for us as an analyst, even if we know a lot about the nuts and bolts of Congress. It's difficult for us as an analyst to get access to this data in a consistent way that would allow us to code it in such a way to facilitate measurement.
The things I'd contribute there are, our first set of scores really was getting the conversation going about legislative effectiveness, and we were able to find a lot of things. We'll be curious when we come up with this second set of scores. Are they just highly correlated with what we have already? It's the same people getting work done behind the scenes, or are they taking us in different directions? And just the same way that it was really valuable for us to dive into the different stages of our first set of scores. We'll be very curious, on new language added to bills, how much of that can we track down to other bills from other members or to amendments and so on, and how much of that is really black boxed. And if it is something that we've never seen before sponsored in other language of other bills, then what can we say about that? Is that mostly added in the committee process? If so, we have to dedicate a lot of efforts to getting transparency in committee. Is it mostly back and forth between the House and Senate? Well, then we better start focusing our efforts there and so on, and just finding out where are the questions that we don't know the answers to. The other thing that I'd say just kind of on this front is we're starting a project on bill ideas that come from the president or from the executive branch. When they have ideas that they want advanced through Congress, are they going to the most effective lawmakers to promote their interest? And since there's this natural then coalition potentially with the president backing these changes, are those bills more likely to move through the lawmaking process? And is it this combination of work with chairs, work with effective lawmakers, and use the force of the executive branch to kind of promote these ideas that really allows that separation of powers to work in the lawmaking process in some interesting ways?